I didn't cry at the funeral. Not because I didn't want to. Believe me, I did. But because something inside me had shut off. Like a switch flip the moment I walked into that overly perfumed chapel and saw Denise dabbing at her eyes like she was the queen of grief. My stepmother, with her perfect chignon and pearl necklace, sitting front and center like she owned not just the funeral, but my father's entire legacy. Mark and Dylan flanked her like loyal sentinels, their matching navy suits crisp, their jaws tight, their eyes dry. I stood in the back, alone. Not one person offered me a seat. Not one person asked how I was holding up. I was invisible, just like I had been my entire childhood. You see, I was the ghost child, the leftover from my father's first marriage, a brief and quiet chapter he didn't talk about once he remarried. He visited, sure. He sent cards, sometimes a gift, but I knew what I was. A side story. He called me his still water. I used to think it meant I was boring, too quiet to be noticed, but later I realized it meant something else, that I held depth, that even when I didn't speak, he saw me. At least, I thought he did, until the will was read. It was a week after the funeral. We all gathered in a law office that smelled of stale coffee and dust-covered leather chairs. I remember gripping the armrest as the lawyer read off the list. The house, the car, the company shares. Everything split between Mark and Dylan. Denise got lifetime access to the vacation home and a generous fund to maintain her lifestyle, whatever that meant. My name wasn't mentioned once, not even a passing sentence. No trinket, no photo, no word. I sat there frozen. My nails dug into the chair, but I didn't say a word. Not when Denise gave me a fleeting glance of pity. Not when Mark looked at me like he'd won. Not when Dylan smirked and asked if I wanted one of Dad's cufflinks as a keepsake. I just nodded, stood up, and left. That night I didn't sleep. I lay in my apartment, staring at the ceiling, trying to replay every conversation I'd ever had with my father. Had he lied when he said he loved me? Was I just a distraction, a secret he'd grown tired of carrying? My heart felt like it was caving in on itself. Grief, yes, but not just from losing him. It was grief from realizing I had never truly had him in the first place. Then came a letter, a plain white envelope, no return address, just my name in that looping, careful handwriting I hadn't seen since I was a teenager. Inside, a short note and a key, no explanation, just a message. For my still water. What they want isn't what matters. What I left you can't be split, stolen, or sold. It's yours alone. You'll know where to look. I knew instantly. The cabin. It was hidden deep in the Smoky Mountains, a place we used to go when I was young, just the two of us. It hadn't been mentioned in the will. It hadn't been touched in years. I hadn't been back since I was maybe 14. But I remembered the smell of pine needles crushed underfoot, the way the trees bent in toward the winding gravel road, and the way the sun always slanted just right through the tall windows at sunset. It wasn't part of the estate anymore. He had sold the land around it long ago, but somehow the cabin had just stayed. I drove there the next day, heart pounding the entire 3-hour drive. I half expected to find the place burned down or locked tight, but the key fit. The door groaned open like it remembered me. Inside, dust blanketed everything. A deer head still hung above the fireplace. The old rocking chair creaked as I walked past. I moved slowly, almost reverently, like I was stepping into a time capsule. I wasn't sure what I was looking for until I saw the floorboard, just slightly out of place. I knelt, pried it up, and there it was, the box. It was old and wooden, hand-carved, the kind of thing people don't make anymore. I opened it, and the breath caught in my throat. Letters, dozens of them, neatly bundled in twine, my name on each one, some yellowed with age, others freshly sealed. At the bottom, a tape, a real VHS, labeled in thick black marker, in case I'm not there. I stood there, holding it in my hands, heart pounding like a war drum. I hadn't even read a word yet, but somehow I knew This was everything I didn't get in that law office, everything they never could take from me, and I had no idea just how much it would change everything. The VCR at the cabin was old, but still worked. I found it under the TV stand, next to a dusty stack of hunting tapes and weather-worn instruction manuals. My hands shook as I plugged it in. The VHS slid in with a soft click, and I sat on the faded couch, knees pressed together, heart racing like I was waiting for a ghost to speak. And then he appeared. My father. Not the polished man in a suit who ran meetings and made deals. Not the half-absent parent who dropped off gifts on weekends. This was a different version of him. Older, tired. He wore a flannel shirt, the sleeves rolled up, his hair grayer than I remembered. The background looked like the cabin. He must have filmed it here. He sat at the dining table, hands clasped, eyes trained on the camera, like he was trying to burn the image into me. "I don't know when you'll watch this," he began. "Maybe years from now. Maybe never. But if you are, it means they took everything else. I knew they would." He paused, looked away. I felt something tighten in my chest. "I wasn't a good father to you," he said, and I know that. I tried, but not hard enough. You were quiet, so quiet, and I thought maybe you didn't need me as much. But I see now that you were just waiting for me to show up. Really, show up. I wish I had. Tears stung my eyes, but I didn't blink. I couldn't look away. I left them everything because that's what they expected. They wanted the house, the company, the symbols. They fought over it even before I was gone. But you never asked for anything. You just showed up. You just loved me. I saw that. I always saw that." He smiled then, soft, sad. "What I'm leaving you is what matters most. Letters, stories, truth. I didn't always have the courage to say things out loud, but I wrote them down. I saved every drawing you made, every photo, every letter you wrote me as a kid. It's all in that box." I looked down on the box on my lap like it had transformed into something sacred. "I don't care if they find out," he said, his voice sharpening. "If they do, they'll dismiss it. Call it junk. But you'll know. You've always known what really matters." The screen went black. I just sat there for a long time after, letting the silence settle, letting my heart ache. Then I opened the first letter. It was dated 1999. I was 6. "Dear Stillwater," it began. "Today we caught fireflies. You said they looked like floating stars. I think you're right. I wanted to tell you then how magical you made that moment, but I didn't. So I'm telling you now. You made the dark feel bright." I laughed. I cried. I read until the light outside the cabin faded and the forest swallowed the sky. The letters spanned years, little glimpses of our moments, regrets he never voiced, memories I thought were lost. The time I broke my arm and he carried me out of the woods. The time I made him pancakes and they were awful, but he ate them anyway. He remembered it all. By the time I reached the most recent letters, his handwriting had grown shakier, his thoughts more raw. One of them said, I've started to feel it. The heaviness, the quiet in my chest that doesn't go away. I think it's coming, and I'm not scared, not really, just sorry. Sorry for not fighting harder to make space for you in the world I built. That night I slept on the floor of the cabin, the box beside me like a lifeline. I hadn't felt this close to him in years, maybe ever. It wasn't the inheritance they got, but it was mine. The next morning, I packed everything carefully, box, letters, the tape, and drove home. I didn't tell anyone. Not yet. It was too new, too fragile. But that fragile piece didn't last long. 2 days later, I got a call from Denise. Her voice was all fake warmth, the kind she used at charity galas. "Sweetheart, I heard you went up to the cabin," she said. "There's really nothing up there but old junk. You shouldn't waste your time. In fact, we were thinking of clearing it out. Foreclosure." Closure, right. I didn't say a word. I just hung up. The next day, Mark texted me. No greeting, no pretense. "What did you find?" I didn't answer. Then Dylan called. Left a voicemail. "You think you're entitled to something? There's nothing left. Don't go digging for drama." That was the moment it shifted. They knew. They didn't know what exactly, but they knew I found something. And they were nervous, which meant whatever my father left me wasn't just sentimental. There was something more, something they didn't want me to have. And suddenly, the inheritance that couldn't be split, stolen, or sold started to feel very, very valuable. I didn't respond. Not to the texts, not to the calls. I turned off my phone for a few days, needing silence to process everything. But inside, my thoughts spun like wildfire. What exactly were they afraid of? The letters were personal, emotional, yes, but not scandalous, not on the surface. But then again, I hadn't read all of them yet. I had barely gotten through half the box. So I went back. Night after work, I lit a candle, sat cross-legged on the floor, and read. One letter at a time. They weren't organized by date, which somehow made the experience more intimate, more like my father was sitting across from me, choosing which memory to share next. There were some letters that hurt to read. Ones where he admitted he wished he'd tried harder to fight Denise when she told him I was a distraction, that she needed him fully focused on their boys. One letter talked about the time she threw out a birthday card he'd written for me and told him it was time to cut the umbilical cord. He wrote that he'd rewritten the card and mailed it behind her back. That card, I remembered. It had been late, but it came. I'd kept it for years. But then, I found that letter, folded twice, hidden inside an envelope with no date or return name. It didn't look like the others. It was sharper, rushed, less polished. If something happens to me, this wasn't an accident. My blood ran cold. I read on. Mark and Dylan have been circling like vultures. I know they're not patient men, and they're angry I won't give them control of the company yet. They keep telling me I'm too sentimental, too old-fashioned, too stuck on the past. I caught Mark digging through my study last week. He said he was just looking for old photos. But I knew better. The rest of the letter described arguments, fights, tension that had been building for months. My father had felt watched, pressured. There were vague mentions of threats, manipulation. If I die suddenly, don't assume it was my time. Don't trust the narrative. You're the only one who ever saw the full picture. My hands trembled. I reread it 5 times. Could he really have thought they wanted him gone? The coroner's report had said heart attack. Sudden, but not suspicious. He was 68, high-stress job, didn't eat well. It had seemed unfortunate, but believable. But now? Now I wasn't so sure, and someone else wasn't either, because the next day a car started showing up outside my apartment. Same one, gray Lexus, parked a few houses down, tinted windows. Never came to the door, never got out, just sat there. Sometimes for an hour, sometimes more. I knew paranoia. I'd lived with it once, during my worst years in college. But this felt different. Calculated. I took down the plate number, called a friend who worked in city records. It was registered to a consulting firm, one that just so happened to be one of the shell companies tied to my father's business network. A side entity, likely created by Denise or Mark, used for security or property management. They were watching me. Why? Because I had the box? Because I knew something I wasn't supposed to? I made a decision that night. I scanned everything, every letter, every page, every photo. I uploaded it to the cloud, sent it to a secure email address I created under a fake name. Then I made a backup drive and put it in a safety deposit box at a bank an hour away, just in case. Then I kept reading. And that's when I discovered the second tape. It had been hidden under the lining of the box. I nearly missed it. A tiny black cassette labeled simply Confession. There was no VCR player for this one. It was a micro cassette, the kind used for voice recorders. I had to order a player online, wait 3 long days, constantly looking over my shoulder, checking my rearview mirror every time I drove. When the player finally arrived, I closed every window in my apartment, turned off the lights, and hit play. His voice was lower this time, raspy, weaker. "I think I made a mistake," he said. "I gave them too much power. I thought Denise loved me. I thought Mark and Dylan would earn their way. But now Now I think they've boxed me out. Not just from the company, from my own life. He coughed. I overheard them a week ago. They were talking about my medication. Said I was on the edge anyway. I confronted them. They said I misunderstood, but the next day my pills were missing. Replaced with a different bottle. The label looked the same, but the pills weren't. I know what I take. I'm not crazy. I froze. They'll say it was natural, that I was overworked. But if I go, if this body gives out, it won't be nature. It'll be them. The tape ended, just like that. And I realized I had more than a box of memories. I had evidence. I didn't sleep that night. Not even for a minute. I lay there in bed, staring at the ceiling, the soft hum of the refrigerator, the only sound in the silence. My father's voice echoed over and over in my mind. That hoarse whisper, "It won't be nature, it'll be them." I kept playing back everything that had happened since the funeral. The cold faces, the polite dismissal, the sudden surveillance. I kept asking myself, what did they think I would do with this information? And more importantly, what should I do? I wasn't a lawyer. I wasn't rich or powerful. I didn't have influence, just some scan letters, a voice on a decades-old cassette, and a gut feeling that something terrible had happened. But what I did have was time and pain and the kind of quiet fury that doesn't scream. It simmers, it sharpens, it waits. I started digging. I took a few personal days from work. I drove to the small mountain town near the cabin and visited the local pharmacy. My father had always been old school. He didn't trust online prescriptions or chain stores. Sure enough, they remembered him. The pharmacist was kind. A soft-spoken man named Ed, who blinked twice when I showed him a photo and asked about Dad's prescriptions. He pulled up the records, printed them for me. And right there, 3 weeks before his death, the medication had been changed. Different manufacturer, same dosage, different brand. Not an unheard of thing, but enough to raise questions, especially when paired with what the microcassette said. I took it further. With some help from a friend who studied pharmacology, I learned that the replacement pills, while technically the same drug, were known for inconsistent absorption. Some patients with heart conditions were especially sensitive to brand changes. It wasn't proof of murder, but it was proof of neglect, or at least a reckless disregard for his health. If Denise or the boys had intentionally switched it, knowing it could destabilize him, that was something, but it still wasn't enough. No court would convict on implication. I needed more. I went back to the cabin, tore the place apart, every drawer, every shelf, even the underside of furniture. And I found something, a small safe embedded in the back of an old wooden dresser. It had a digital keypad, and for a few minutes I stared at it, heart pounding. What would he use? What code? I tried my birthday. Nothing. His? Nothing. Then I remembered what he used to call me. Still water. The numbers popped into my head. 7829. My birthday, reversed. Still water. Deep, inverted. It clicked open. Inside were only two things, a flash drive and a small stack of legal documents. The flash drive was encrypted, but thankfully it came with a note, a 6-digit code and instructions. Play on Mac only. Do not use Wi-Fi when viewing. I followed it to the letter, drove to a library 2 towns over, used an old Mac in the back corner, turned off the Wi-Fi, and plugged it in. What I saw made me sick. It was surveillance footage. Grainy, but clear enough. My father's home office. A timestamp, 3 days before his death. The video showed Mark entering the study with gloves on. He opened the drawer, pulled out a bottle of pills, looked around, then swapped them with a bottle from his coat pocket. Then he smirked, just slightly, like he was proud of himself. I covered my mouth. My hands started shaking. The video kept playing. 10 minutes later, Dylan walked in. He picked up the same bottle, checked it, nodded, and left. They weren't just scheming. They were coordinated. I had no idea how Dad had managed to get this recording. Hidden cameras, maybe, or some kind of motion system. But he had clearly known something might happen. He'd planned for it, for me to find it, for them to be exposed. And yet, I didn't call the police right away. Because part of me knew this wasn't just about justice. This was about choice. My choice. I could turn everything in, blow it all up, take it to the authorities, the media, the courts. But there was something more satisfying growing inside me. A darker idea, a quieter kind of revenge. I knew their world. The boys, Denise, they cared about image, power, status. They lived in country clubs and private boardrooms. What they feared most wasn't prison. It was ruin, reputation, legacy. So I made a plan. I didn't tell a soul, not my best friend, not my ex, not even the friend who helped me research the meds. I kept everything to myself, sealed behind the cool mask I'd worn at the funeral. Let them keep thinking I was the forgotten one, the outsider, the silent daughter in the shadows. Let them keep underestimating me. That was the first part of the revenge. The second part required patience. I started small, reached out to a reporter, anonymously, someone I'd followed for years who specialized in uncovering corruption in family-run businesses. I sent her a tip. Start looking into the ledger discrepancies at Marlowe and Sons. Follow the money from the 2021 fiscal year. I knew they'd buried things. My father had hinted in one of his letters that Mark had been siphoning funds through fake vendor contracts. I didn't need to prove it, just point the right eyes in the right direction. Once a journalist gets a whiff of smoke, they'll chase the fire. Next, I mailed copies of the scan letters, not all, just carefully selected ones, to 3 members of the company's board. I included a note that read, "Before you confirm Mark's promotion, consider what you never knew about the founder's final months." I didn't need a reply, just a ripple, and the ripples began almost immediately. Within 2 weeks, I heard from a former employee who'd once worked closely with my father. He'd been pushed out right after the funeral. Quiet severance, no explanations. He told me over coffee that something had always felt off about how quickly Mark and Dylan seized control after their father's death. Like they had it all lined up, days in advance. More ripples. I planted a story on a local business blog, again, anonymously, a reflective piece about how family-run empires often collapse when greed outpaces integrity. It wasn't about my family, not by name, but anyone in the know could read between the lines. It started to spread, slow at first, then faster. Online whispers, message boards, LinkedIn murmurs, the kind of buzz that makes investors nervous and board members twitchy. And then I made my boldest move yet. I sent them a letter, handwritten, like his had been to me. To Denise, Mark, and Dylan, it began. I know what you did. I have his voice. I have his warnings. I have the video. And I have nothing to lose. I didn't threaten them. I didn't demand money or revenge or apologies. All I said was, "You erased me." But he didn't. And now I get to choose what survives of his legacy and what doesn't. I knew they'd panic. I knew Mark especially would spiral. The man had a temper wrapped in a smile, the kind of arrogance that crumbled when it met unpredictability. And sure enough, 3 days after I mailed the letter, I saw the Lexus again. This time, parked directly across the street. Not hiding anymore, just watching. But I didn't flinch. I let them see me living my life, going to work, getting groceries, laughing in a cafe. Because that's what they couldn't understand. The slow unraveling, the drip of consequence. They expected confrontation, a courtroom brawl, some tabloid scandal. They didn't expect strategy. And then came the real twist. One of the board members, the oldest, Mr. Hammond, reached out, asked to meet. I agreed cautiously. We met in a quiet corner of a botanical garden. He looked tired, kind. He didn't beat around the bush. "Your father was planning to change his will," he told me. "He never got the chance. The papers weren't filed, but he told me what he wanted." I blinked. My chest tightened. "He wanted to leave you the cabin outright, and a significant stake in the company." He said, "You were the only one who truly understood legacy." Tears welled up in my eyes. I fought to keep them there. "But legally, nothing changed," he added quietly. "The will stands. But I wanted you to know." I thanked him. genuinely. But I didn't tell him about the evidence. I didn't need to. Because what came next was inevitable. The reporter's story dropped like a hammer. Front page, Marlowe and Sons, a legacy in decay, anonymous sources, leaked letters, financial fraud, ethical violations, talk of internal betrayal. Denise went silent. Mark issued a defensive press statement that only made things worse. Dylan's name started disappearing from press releases altogether. The company's value dropped overnight. And the letters, the real ones, I sent them to one final place, a small archive at the local university labeled Private Collection John Marlowe Personal Correspondence. Anonymous donation. He deserved to be remembered for more than the money they carved up like vultures. But just when I thought it was over, I got a call. Block number. I answered. And the voice on the other end said, "You think you've won, but you don't know everything." At first, I thought it was some prank, some bitter executive trying to spook me, or Mark lashing out in his usual veiled, passive-aggressive way. But the voice on the line wasn't Mark's. It was lower, older, gravelly, with something behind it that felt personal. "You think you've won," the man repeated, "but you don't know everything." I asked who it was. No answer, just a faint breath, a pause, and then the click of disconnection. I stood there, staring at the phone in my hand, heart pounding so hard I could feel it in my ears. The air in the room had gone heavy. That call wasn't random. It was timed. It came after the fallout, after the article, after the board started taking steps to remove Mark from the company. It wasn't a coincidence. I sat down and went back over everything. The letters, the tapes, the footage. I played my father's last video again, slower this time, watching not just what he said, but how he looked, his face, his eyes. There was pain there, yes, but also fear, a kind of tension in his shoulders I hadn't noticed before, as if he knew what was coming, but didn't know how deep it really went. And then, in the third tape, buried in a stack of older letters I hadn't fully gone through, I found something I'd missed, a name. Cliff. The letter was dated a year before he died. It was short, rushed, scrawled in messy handwriting. "Still water. If anything ever happens to me and it seems unnatural, look for Cliff. He knows things. Things I didn't want to believe. Things I should have reported. He's scared, but he's honest." I had no idea who Cliff was. No last name, no contact info. Just a first name and that cryptic warning. But it was enough. I started looking. Pulled out every old file I could find from the cabin. Scanned through invoices, meeting notes, work receipts. And there, at the bottom of a maintenance log for the cabin, I saw it. Cliff Richards, groundskeeper, retired. Last payment made 8 years ago. I tracked him down. He lived in a trailer on the edge of town, a quiet, isolated place with rusted wind chimes and a dog that barked until my throat hurt. Cliff was old, weathered, and wary when I showed up. At first, he pretended not to know me. Then I said my father's name, and everything changed. He invited me in. We sat in silence for a while, then he poured 2 cups of coffee, burnt and bitter, and stared at the wall as he spoke. "Your dad, he was a good man," Cliff said finally, "but he got mixed up with the wrong people, not just family, investors, men with real power, quiet power. He told me about meetings he'd overheard at the cabin, men in suits with untraceable names, deals that were never logged, talk of laundering funds through shell companies using the business as a front. Cliff didn't know all the details. He was just the groundskeeper, but he knew enough to be afraid. They started talking about him like he was a liability," Cliff said, eyes dark. "Especially after he said he was rewriting the will. He wanted out, wanted to sell his share and leave the boys with nothing but their own ambition." That's when it hit me. It wasn't just greed. It was self-preservation. My father wanted to pull the plug, disentangle himself from something corrupt, something dangerous. And Mark and Dylan, maybe even Denise, weren't just fighting for inheritance. They were covering tracks. "Why didn't you come forward?" I asked Cliff. He shook his head slowly. because people like that don't just sue you, they make you disappear. And I've got grandkids. We sat in silence again. I looked at this man, this frightened, regretful witness, and I saw what my father must have seen. Not just an employee, a man trying to survive a truth that was too big, too ugly, too dangerous to carry alone. I left Cliffs with more than I came for. Not hard evidence, but context, a deeper, darker motive. Something that made everything else, the pill swap, the video, the cold stares at the funeral, snap into focus. And then I remembered the phone call. You don't know everything. They weren't bluffing. There was more. I drove home that night with my stomach in knots. I had blown up their public image, yes. I had cost them the company, the polished reputation. But I hadn't touched the real rot yet. The external connections, the shadow investors, the deals my father never wanted to make but got dragged into anyway. And if those men were still out there, still watching, then this wasn't over. Not even close. It didn't happen overnight. Justice rarely does. But it came, piece by piece, like puzzle fragments falling into place. Every lie, every stolen dollar, every betrayal, unraveled in full view. After I met Cliff, I didn't rush to expose the shadowy dealings. This wasn't something I could post online or whisper to a reporter. I needed real proof, something that couldn't be buried or denied. So I went back to the cabin, back to the floorboards, back to the notes. I rewatched the videos frame by frame, listened to background sounds, scanned documents with a forensic lens I never knew I had. It took weeks, but eventually I found it. A flash drive, taped behind a drawer in his desk. My father must have hidden it at the last minute. It contained spreadsheets, contracts, and most damning of all, recordings. Conversations between Mark, Dylan, and anonymous investors, talking about creative accounting, fake consultants, laundering cash through overseas charities. And then, in one chilling recording, my father's voice. I'm pulling out. I won't sign this. Followed by Mark's cold, calm reply. Then you're done. That was the nail. I went straight to a financial crimes attorney who handled corporate whistleblower cases. He didn't blink. The case was strong, real strong. He built the narrative, gathered the timelines, confirmed the accounts. The FBI took interest. 2 months later, it was all over the news. Local business empire at center of financial fraud investigation. Sons of late entrepreneur under criminal probe. Whistleblower reveals secret deals tied to political donors. The empire crumbled. Mark and Dylan were arrested, their assets frozen. Their glossy brand, the one they'd poured their identities into, was stripped to the bone in public. Mark, the face of the company, sat silent in court while prosecutors played tapes of his voice orchestrating the fraud. His wife filed for divorce days later. Dylan tried to pin everything on his older brother, crying in a courtroom that once held his swagger. And Denise? She tried to slither away unnoticed, but it turned out several accounts were in her name. Shells, offshore, traceable. She was next. They all went down, one by one. Not in a storm of vengeance, but in a slow, suffocating collapse of their own design. And me? I sat there in the courtroom in the very seat they once ignored me from, watching them face the world, not as the golden heirs, but as con men, cowards, and criminals. I didn't cheer, I didn't cry, I just breathed. For the first time in a long time, I breathed. Cliff testified, protected by whistleblower immunity. He looked 20 pounds lighter after it all. We talked after the trial, and I promised him his grandkids would never have to worry. He'd helped me see what my father couldn't finish. That meant everything. As for my father's legacy, the business was dismantled, but the truth remained. His name was cleared. The headline shifted from scandal to redemption. The letters he left me became part of a documentary. I allowed it on one condition, that the focus remain on his words, not the money, on what he stood for, not what they tried to steal. And somewhere in that process, I found myself again. I moved out of the city, bought a small home near the lake, not far from the cabin. I didn't want mansions or media deals. I wanted quiet, I started writing essays, memoir style blogs about family, about betrayal, about what it means to really inherit something. The strange part? People listened, people who had been erased, like me, people whose voices had been drowned out by louder, shinier families. I built a small community, one that felt honest. And then, one afternoon, maybe a year later, I got a letter. No return address, just my name. Inside was a single sentence, typed in all caps. Something should have stayed buried. I smiled, a soft, steady smile, because I wasn't scared anymore. They'd buried my name, my identity, my father's truth for years. But they didn't win. They didn't get the last word. I did. They got power, they got money, they got illusions, and they lost everything. I got him, his words, his love, his truth, and it was worth every damn thing. The last time I saw Mark, he was being led out of the courtroom in cuffs. He glanced at me, not with rage, but with this blank, hollow stare, like he couldn't quite believe I'd done it, that the quiet girl, the forgotten daughter, had taken it all down. I stood, met his eyes, and gave him one nod. And as they pulled him away, I whispered under my breath, "Still waters run deep." He heard it. He flinched. Good.